Hey everyone, it's Nick here. So this week I'm going to be trying to make a wood engraving. So I found this cutting board. If you remember a long time ago when I said I took a trip down to Oklahoma, I was visiting an Asian grocery store over there, and they had these cutting boards in stock, and I noticed that it was an end grain cutting board, and I saw a similar cutting board back in my grad school days at another Asian grocery store that had a very similar looking wood, and that was also a product of Vietnam. And on that cutting board, I don't have the label of it anymore. I think it said it was like acacia wood that was impregnated with resin. And so I figured I'd give it a shot. The cutting board is pretty uniform in thickness, relatively speaking, at least better than what I've tried. I've tried to make my own ungrained cutting boards before, but I could never get it like a perfect flatness or anything like that. And so these cutting boards are rather flat, which is pretty nice for me. So I'm going to start off by sanding this cutting board because it'll be easier to sand it while it's still a bigger piece, easier to handle. And I'm going to sand this all the way up to about 2000 grit. And so I'm going to try and get this block as smooth as possible. The smoother the block is, the easier the ink is going to release from the surface, which is going to help me when I print, because I'm going to need every advantage I can get to make sure that my lines don't fill in and I don't lose my entire image. And so I'm just going to mark where I'm going to cut, and then take a quick trip to the miter saw, and voila, I have my matrix. And so I'm going to stain the matrix black with some India ink, and that way it's easier to see where I've carved and where I haven't carved, and kind of what it's going to look like when it's printed with black ink. And then I'm going to give it a top coat of shellac to kind of help it be a little bit smoother, kind of rigid up the surface a little bit better so it doesn't really splinter and kind of get rough cut marks. I've kind of thought about mixing my India ink and my shellac, and so I can mix this into one step, but I haven't gotten around to see if that works or not. And so all that's left is the subject matter. And coming up, I have an exchange due from my undergrad. Some alums and people I know do an exchange every year, and so I thought I'd do a piece for that. And so the theme is step by step, and when I hear that, it brings up themes of kind of meticulousness and taking things slow, one step at a time. And so to tie that back in with my own body of work, I usually make work about things that happen in my life. And recently I've been at home and I've been taking care of my parents' dog, and this little guy's been quite the handful, and in general the kind of meticulous nature you need to train a dog. And so I know one day I'll probably get really hungry, and as a last resort I'll probably try to eat him. And so before that can happen, I'm going to set him free. And so that's what this piece is about, just kind of me casting this dog out into the city to be free. And so I have to admit, I have no real education in wood engraving. I've just kind of picked up some engraving tools, and I've been just trying to figure it out as I go. But I've basically been treating it the same way as I treat a lino cut, except I can get much smaller lines and they seem to hold up pretty well. But I do have to hold the tool a little bit differently than when I do a lino cut, which is a little bit weird and taking some getting used to. And so now it's time for everyone's favorite segment, what did I do last week? And so last week in Nick News, just a little PSA for everybody, the Shamrock Shake is back in McDonald's, and if you haven't tried one, it's really terrible. Nothing about it tastes like, I guess it kind of tastes like a milkshake, but nothing about it tastes shamrock nor shaky. It's very processed, very chemically. That dye looks very chemically, it's very neon, but for some reason I keep coming back every year, and so you should probably go and get one yourself. And man, when you wake up the next morning, you are going to feel really, really dehydrated, but damn, they got me hooked on it. There's meth in there or something, I don't know. I keep coming back for it. Oh, and I also got a new pair of loops, so it can help me engrave a little bit better. Once I did that lino cut piece a few weeks back, I kind of noticed that it's hard to kind of hunch over my workpiece and carve without seeing it really close, and so I invested in a pair of kind of far throw loops. These ones are the ones that dentists use, because I noticed that dentists kind of sit pretty far back from my face whenever they're working on me, and so they must have some pretty good loops. So I got this one, and I think it's been really nice. The first day I wore them, it kind of gave me a little bit of a headache, but it's kind of like when you just get a brand new pair of glasses and you put them on for the first day, that kind of weirdness you get. But after the next day, it was pretty fine, nice and settled into it, and I really enjoy these. And so right now what you're seeing is kind of what I'm seeing when I carve things. I've kind of got this little magnifying glass over the lens of the camera, and this is what the block gets to see when it looks back at me. And I really enjoy working with these loops, but you know, every now and then you just kind of have to take a step back and work on the kind of overall contrast of the piece. And so usually I do the kind of like the fine detail, put in the light line work into all of these objects, and then I take off the loops, and then I kind of take a step back so I can kind of see how everything, you know, reads next to each other, and then kind of work on the values that everything has, and kind of temper with the contrasts and the brightness of certain spots in the piece. But I will say one of the downsides to covering the piece in shellac is that it's very hard to sketch on. Other than this kind of iron oxide transfer that I have on here, Sharpies and pencils, they don't show up very much, and they rub off really well or really easily, which is, I guess, is the point. You don't really want things sticking to your block. That was the whole point of me shellacking it, but makes it a little bit harder to sketch on the block. So now that I'm done carving, it's time to print, and I'm going to need to do a little bit of preparations in order for this to print really well. And so my main goal is to not have my block and my fine lines fill in with ink, and so we're going to need to use as minimal amount of ink as possible so it doesn't squish into those lines. And in order to use the minimal amount of ink possible, I need to print with dampened paper, and I'm going to use a nice thin flexible paper. And so here I've got some kitakata, and I'm going to tear it into fourths, and then I'm going to construct a damp pack. And so for this damp pack, I wanted to impart the bare minimum amount of moisture. I need enough moisture that it really picks up a lot of the ink, but not too much moisture that it's going to emboss or tear when I run it through the press. And so for my damp pack, I'm actually going to take this newsprint, and I'm going to spray that with water, and then I'm going to let this sit for about 30 minutes so I can let that moisture kind of equalize and distribute itself across the newsprint. And then I'm actually going to put my sheets of kitakata in between those sheets of newsprint, and I'm going to let that sit for about 30 more minutes so it can kind of equalize and impart that moisture upon the kitakata. And so when it comes to relief inks, I have a little bit of this leftover black that I usually use for my lino cuts, and what this is the Gamblin Tom Hugs Outlaw Black, because I like how stiff it is and how rich it is in its pigment, but sometimes it's a little bit too stiff and it's a little bit too dark, and so I usually cut it with a little bit of that Gamblin Titanium White just to kind of lighten it up a little bit. And then I add a little bit of tack reducer and a little bit of magnesium carbonate, and the goal here is to get an ink that is really stiff, really rich with the pigment. That way it can be printed in a thin layer but still be very opaque. But I also want it to be low tack so it doesn't tear my paper when I try to peel it from the block, and all of that ink releases from the block, and that way I can get away with using less ink. Now that my block's inked up, let's take it over to the press and give it a little print. I'm just going to do a little drop and pray registration because I already know that I'm going to have to trim these down into the correct size for the exchange edition. So I already know that my block isn't completely flat. I noticed a few low spots around the top right corner, and so I'm going to print using a felt to kind of overcome that unevenness in the block. And I'm going to print usually with 2 pieces of newsprint on top of my good paper. That way it'll kind of cancel out the texture of the felt. And finally, I get to see what the last 2 weeks of carving have amounted to. But I can't stop and stare for too long because I need to get this into my compression dryer so that it dries flat. And so by dampening my paper, I've introduced a new problem, which is it's going to be warped when it dries. And so to ensure that it dries flat, I'm going to dry this under pressure, and so I'm going to construct a compression dryer, which is going to comprise of a sheet of cardboard, and then a nice synthetic Pellon felt, and then a very exorbitant sheet of cotton blotter paper. And on top of this, I'm going to put my print, and I'm going to put a piece of newsprint just so that ink from the fresh print doesn't transfer onto my nice clean blotters. And then I'm going to complete the sandwich by putting another blotter, another Pellon felt, and then another piece of cardboard and a heavy weight on top of that. And so this is going to allow the moisture to get soaked into the nice blotter papers and then soaked into the felts, and then it's going to soak into the cardboard or the corrugated board, and then air can be passed through the flutes of the corrugation, and that'll kind of facilitate in this evaporation process. And so I'm going to print a few more of these blocks, and there you have it, a finished print. Now, I didn't finish printing the whole edition because I think it needs a little bit more work. I can't say that I'm completely happy with this print. I think it's a little bit darker than I was intending it to be. Some of these lines on the bottom of the buildings kind of filled in, and I lost a lot of my bright whites, and some of that contrast isn't there, but that might be attributed more to me using a nice toned paper like Kitakata. Maybe if I use something brighter like Masa or Hosho, I would have gotten that contrast that I would have wanted. And so I'm going to do a little bit more editing on this block, but time's up for this week's video, and so I thought I'd show you kind of what I've been doing. I'll probably just work on this block in the background. It's pretty nice to just kind of take a step back and just kind of think about it for a little bit, come back to it later when you've got some fresh eyes, the frustration's gone, and so that's probably what I'll do. But that's been what I've been working on for the past 2 weeks, just kind of slowly chipping away at this block. And so thanks for watching me try this wood engraving off of this cutting board. But I guess if you have any advice for wood engraving, I'd love to hear it. But I guess I'll see you next week.